All right, I'm back. It's Wednesday, and this whiteboard review is going to be BCA Introduction to Web Design. We talked about technology background, and we are always talking about web pages each time we meet. All right, one of the first things also we talked about was learning. The learning materials in Canvas the students are to go through, and then we will review those learning materials and work on some skills in class. If you're not sure, ask. I'll review that again at the end. Today we talked about hardware, and we listed different types of hardware: a PC, a laptop, a tablet, smartphone. There's all kinds of devices that are used nowadays in computing. In fact, we will talk about the term computing device. Any device that computes. That sounds funny, but any device that computes. Now the next thing is what communicates with the hardware. Okay, well, software. Software does, but a certain software called the operating system communicates with the hardware. So we looked at 3 examples. We mentioned for operating systems. We mentioned Android, iOS, and Windows 10. We also mentioned briefly Linux. We have phones that are either typically, not completely, but most of them are either Android or Apple. Windows 10 is a very popular operating system, and Linux is becoming more popular, and we'll talk more about that later. So we'll refer to the operating systems very often. We can talk about those as being the OS. Okay, now the next thing talked about are applications. Applications communicate with the operating system. We're going to review that next Wednesday. But the applications we looked at today: browser, and we talked about email client, and there are lots of applications. Literally, probably millions. And the applications communicate with the operating system. The operating system communicates with the hardware. That's also why an application is designed to work with a particular operating system. More on that later. And then the last thing here, users. People communicate with the application primarily. Now, you'll learn a little bit more where we're going to communicate through all 3 of the layers, but primarily you communicate through the application. Use a browser to get information from the internet. We define user interface and user experience. This is key. That is key. The user experience. If you want a user to come back to your website, you want them to have a good experience. The interface is real important in dealing with this, but their experience is what is going to make it work. So whether you're developing an app or a website or whatever, it's the user experience. It's like I asked half the students today had iPhones and half had Android. I asked the iPhones people, well, I like my iPhone. I like the way it works. Or somebody will tell me it likes actually how it feels or whatever. It's the user experience then that is key. Okay? And we'll refer back to that later on. Okay, let's move ahead over to LTE. All right. Next thing, we start talking more and more about the internet. The internet is really just a transport system, okay? For you to go from, let's say here at NIACC, you're going to go from a PC here at NIACC, okay? And you're going to look at your Google document at Google, and Google's going to send the information you want back to you. The information's not in the internet. The internet's just a transport system that moves it through. More on that later. So we say, what kind of devices do people own? And some people have a tablet and so forth. But I said, we're going to talk about two areas here. We'll talk about PCs, laptops, and phones right now. Okay? So we'll deal with those right now. And we talked about how they connect in. So here's again, I mentioned computing devices. So your phone, we talked about here on campus, your phone can be connected in through Wi-Fi to an access point here on campus. And then that allows you to have connectivity to the internet. Or let's say you have your phone and you're out in the parking lot, or you're too far, and switch over to LTE. Okay? And that would be like for example, we have a 2 gigabyte plan for LTE. You pay for your base, and then you pay for your data. Ours is through US Cellular, but yours could be through Verizon and all those other options for smartphones nowadays. So you're either going one way or another. People tend to, when they're on campus, they would connect to the Wi-Fi here and use NIACC resources so they don't use up their data plan. Now your traffic is going through NIACC though. Okay? Something to be aware of. All right. A couple more things here. What does that mean, 2 gigabyte? And then in some cases, like for example, let me give an example up here. NIACC's connection, they have a connection up here that's 120 million bits per second connection. So here we're talking about bits per second, we're talking about speed. Here we're talking about bytes, we're talking about quantity. So here's defined a byte and a bit. So let's talk about that. The binary digit is a byte. Binary digit, that's where the word byte comes from, and it's just 1 or 0. 8 bits together give us typically a byte. Now I give an example here. An example in which I have 8 bits, that's actually a capital A using the ASCII code. We'll talk about that a little more later on. Alright, 3 more pages to go. This is not a whole lot more. We did talk, though, a fair amount about Tier 1 providers, and you can look those up. Tier 1 providers in the United States would give you things like Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, and so forth. They provide the interconnections through the internet. They don't charge each other, and they provide the connections. And then companies, let's just say Mediacom, they connect in, and then they sell services as an internet service provider to people like me in my house. And we pay based on speed, and they also have a cap on how much data we can send to. See how that works? So we looked at an example on a web server running Linux and Apache web services. More on that later. But we connected in and out of that. We don't know exactly where it was, but they must have an internet service provider that they go through. And stored there somewheres is my web page that we looked at today in class. It's on there somewheres. And where this is, I don't know, but I know they're connected to the internet using an internet service provider that they pay for, and then I pay to have a website there. Now there's lots of ways to have a website. So there we looked at the example where we looked at HTML, HTML5, and cascading style sheets, and tags, and so forth. So everybody was familiar with HTML, hypertext markup language. And then we looked up hypertext transfer protocol, this ability to link one website to another, or to get to a website from a browser. We looked up michaeldirksen.com. That was a domain name. And we talked a little bit about other ways to make a website. Wix, and we're going to look at WordPress, excuse me. That was an old slip up. WordPress. Right. This part right here was a little bit of history on how we got to the internet, and I'll be very brief. AT&T was a monopoly in the early 1900s. The Cold War caused the government to create an ARPANET and connected some universities, and they wanted to create this vast connection where if some disaster happened in one part of the country, it wouldn't cut off another part of the country. And then a little bit of history, AT&T was split up in 1984, and they created a whole group of these, okay, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, all these, and they developed a little more history to it than that, but there was no monopoly for telephone. Then these small telephone companies could spring up, CLTel, Clear Lake. And then in the 90s, late 90s, people invented this HTML, hypertext transfer protocol, and what developed out of that was the World Wide Web. I'll write that in another color. World Wide Web. And that's where we use a browser in order to grab information through the internet. It's not in the information. The information's sitting at these connections. The internet, really the word comes from internetworking. Ah, finally. I bet you were saying, when will you ever get done? So, we can use a browser from our home. Let me use a little different color here. Let's try this. We can use a browser from home. I can go to Uber. They have all this information, and I can find a driver, or a driver find me, or a combination, and then they will send a car to my home if Uber is available. And then they automatically go to my bank account out here in the cloud somewhere and transfer that money to me and to the driver. And then they keep a little bit. They keep a little bit. So you can see the internet really just acts as like the interstate. The interstate gets us between locations. You're going to go watch a concert in Minneapolis. You don't say the concert's on the interstate. You use the interstate to get to Minneapolis to watch the concert. You use the internet to get the information from all of these sources out there, right? All those sources. You use a URL, Universal Resource Locator, to find the sources. Okay, last page. We have You should have done the opening materials. You should have done the preparation. Look through them again. Make sure you don't miss any links that were in there that had you do something. And you should be working on Unit 1, Communications. I'll have Unit 2 ready to go next Wednesday. It's not there yet, but I'll have it there by Wednesday. And so we're going to complete this unit on Wednesday. So you need to do all the work. You need to go through the instruction objectives, go through the learning material, activities, and then there's 2 assignments we'll do together, and we'll do the unit completion next Wednesday. Remember, if you get stuck on an assignment, and you spend 15 to 30 minutes on it, remember to set it aside and send me a note, email me, or let me know you're having a problem, and we'll try to fix it, or we'll fix it Wednesday when you get to class. All right. Great start. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions.